Welcome to the Communist Labor Party podcast. Here we feature presentations and educational pieces we feel are important in the fight against capitalism. Our inaugural episode is taken from a presentation at a regional Red School Educational Summit the CLP hosted in April of 2016. In this presentation, Sophia Burns of the CLP and of RATPAC, the Revolutionary Alliance of Trans People Against Capitalism, speaks about the vigilance needed to protect movements and political organizations from being systematically patriarchal.
Hi, so on the schedule it says that I am teaching gender/feminist/trans issues. Now that covers a little bit of a broader range that I'm actually going to go into. What I'm going to talk about today is the ways that unless we take very conscious, very deliberate countermeasures, our political work will end up being structured by patriarchy, by systemic male dominance. And unless we do these very specific things that I'm going to talk about, then that will happen unconsciously and unintentionally. So, basically, the structure of this presentation. First, I'm going to go into a couple of basic terms and concepts. Then I am going to talk about the different roles involved in political and activist work. Which of those roles tend to get more prestige and less? Which of those roles tend to be done by men and masculine-coded people versus female and feminine-coded people? And after I talk about the roles in activism, I'm going to talk about our notions of what is more radical versus less radical, because I think there's a hierarchy in terms of which actions we view as more revolutionary and which rhetoric we view as more revolutionary. And I'm going to talk about the gender dynamics of that. And then, finally, I will move into what we can do to address this, and with whatever time is left, I will open the floor for comments and or questions. First basic concept, social reproduction. When we think about work, when we say work, usually what you think of is going to your job and clocking in, and you got the tasks that you do for the boss, and they take their cut of the value that your labor produces. But here's the thing. Sitting in this building or going out, literally anything that you see is there because of human labor. It is there not just because somebody made it, but because somebody put it there, put the table there, because someone cleaned the table, because someone mopped the floor. Those types of work, the day-to-day activities that keep basic everyday life functioning, are called socially reproductive labor. That's the work of social reproduction, and overwhelmingly, it is gendered work. It is work that falls, usually without comment, often without anyone noticing, to female and feminine-coded people. Patriarchy is about labor. It's about who does what work and what types of work are associated with prestige and power. And additionally, in addition to housework, cooking and cleaning, and so on and so forth, socially reproductive labor includes emotional work. That's where, if you have something good or something bad that you need to talk about, who's going to listen to you? Who's going to do the mental, emotional labor of being a good listener and showing interest and so on and so forth? And that is gendered. Overwhelmingly, female and feminine-coded people do that for each other and for men and male-coded people. And most of the time, male and masculine-coded people don't do that for each other or for women. It is a type of gendered work. And that goes into the second basic concept that I want to talk about, which is the division of labor. Certain types of work are gendered as masculine. It's usually male and masculine people doing things that happen outside the home, that are paid, that are acknowledged as work disproportionately. whereas it is disproportionately female and feminine coded people who do the labor of social reproduction, who do the labor of caretaking. And I mean that in a very broad sense, not just physically taking care of children and elders, but emotionally taking care of everybody, taking care of spaces, taking care of the social cohesiveness of different groups. And that applies to activist groups as much as any others. The third and last basic concept I want to explain is what's called toxic masculinity. Who here has heard of toxic masculinity? All right, that's nearly everybody. That's good. Basically, toxic masculinity is the notion that violence and power and confrontation and strength and maleness and masculine aesthetic presentation and such can all be collapsed down into basically the same thing, that each of those things, relates to all the others. And if you want to be a real man, then you have to be stoic and you can't show weak emotions and you can't do care work and you have to be all violent and tough and Rambo. And that is an attitude that pervades a whole lot of the activist milieu. And because of that influence of toxic masculinity, as we'll see in a second, the types of roles and the types of activism that are most consistent with toxic masculinity's notions of what is more powerful and more strong and more valuable tend to influence what we regard as better or more worthy work. And while that's disproportionately male and masculine coded people doing that type of work and getting that prestige, it's not strictly a question of what someone's gender is, but it's a question of what types of values they have to choose to adopt. So, moving on to the first area of concrete discussion, the division of labor within activism. So, no matter what you're doing, whether you're gathering signatures for a petition, whether you're chaining yourself to the gate outside of a nuclear lab in New Mexico, which happened a few years ago when I was there, or whatever it is you're doing, there's a whole bunch of different roles. There's the people who make the decisions and talk to the press and write whatever documents come out of it. There's the people who are actually physically out there getting seen, maybe getting arrested. And there are the people who make the coffee and pour it for the meetings, who clean up, who make sure that there's a space there. There are the people who handle the menial logistical, fill out the roster at each meeting grunt work. And most of all, and this is what's least seen, there are the people who do the emotional labor of keeping all these intense Marxist egos in check. And I think anyone who's been around the communist subculture knows exactly what I'm talking about. And then finally, which is even more invisible, literally isn't seen at activist meetings or events, there are the people who take care of children, who take care of elders, who do all of the care work necessary to allow people to have free time to do activism. And one thing that I have noticed, and I bet a lot of y'all have as well, is first off, you can generally get a notion of how many male and masculine coded people versus female and feminine coded people are associated with a given role based on the degree to which it is public, the degree to which it has decision-making power and influence, the degree to which it gets respect and recognition from other activists and maybe the public at large, the degree to which it's thought of as real activism. And that maps on to whether or not it is masculinized work or feminized work, whether it's prestigious masculine labor or whether it's social reproduction and care work. So in general, something that you notice is that men and masc people get the stuff that involves making decisions, that involves recognition, that gets praise and gets called activism, while the more you get toward the feminine-coded social reproduction end, the less it gets talked about and the less respect it gets, which leads, I think, pretty neatly into the next area of discussion, which is the ways that we think of what is more radical versus less radical. And I'm going to talk about that in two areas. Firstly, types of action, types of activism, and secondly, types of rhetoric, slogans and phrasing, so on and so forth. So my belief is that in each of those areas, there's a hierarchy. Most radical, least radical, bunch of steps in the middle. And in terms of actions, what do we think of as most radical of all? Probably armed combat. Go out and fight the cops, shoot the KKK, armed revolution, that type of thing. Even people who reject that as a strategy, at least in my experience, more often than not, will phrase that as, well, that's too extreme. That's going too far. There's still that acknowledgement that it is more radical. Right below that, there would be fistfights, unarmed combat, and anti-fascist type stuff, go out and beat up the Nazis, that kind of thing. A lot of talk of self-defense. Then below that, there's nonviolent direct action and civil disobedience, which a lot of people in some of the more self-identified radical groupings say, if you have some philosophical commitment to not doing something more violent than that, then that makes you less radical. That makes you less of an authentic revolutionary. But at the same time, it's considered radical, and it gets a lot of respect because it often involves breaking the law, and it involves risk and explicit confrontation. Below that, there's electoral work, dealing with elected officials or ballot initiatives at all. And then below that, I would put organizational logistics, setting up phone trees, scheduling meetings, so on and so forth. And then at the very bottom is that invisibilized care work that gives people the free time to do activism when they're not the ones doing the care work, and the emotional labor that keeps groups at a basic level of social functionality, which involves mediating between and calming down these big, intense Marxist egos that you find. Something that maybe some of y'all have noticed as I've gone down this hierarchy, the more revolutionary a behavior gets considered, the more in line with the values of toxic masculinity it is. Confrontation and conflict and violence equate to more revolutionary. Care work and cooperative, not explicitly confrontational stuff gets regarded as less revolutionary, or in the case of care work, often not even as political. Now, the thing is, whether you're a group that does direct action or Antifa, beating up the Nazis, or whatever, each of those types of work is necessary. You can't have your civil disobedience if you don't have someone to look after people's kids and someone to clean the coffee cups after the planning meeting. So it's not a question of what types of work get done, because there is no activism that happens without socially reproductive labor. There is no anything that happens without that labor. So objectively, it doesn't make sense to consider it less radical or less revolutionary. It is necessary and inevitable for any human activity. But it doesn't get that same cachet. It doesn't have that sense of, oh yeah, we are really serious now. We're going out and doing some real shit, y'all. And that, I think, has to do with this broad acceptance of the values of toxic masculinity that living under patriarchy gives all of us, regardless of gender. Now, similarly, if you look at the types of political rhetoric that are considered more radical versus less radical, there's a very similar hierarchy. It matches up actually pretty closely. At the top, the most radical, most revolutionary type rhetoric is stuff like, smash the bourgeois state, bring the whole fucking system down. So, language of confrontation, destruction, and violence. Below that, you get the language of resistance and obstruction. Refuse and resist, say no to the war machine, whatever. Not explicit violence or destruction, but still very confrontational, very oppositional. Below that, I would say, you get slogans appealing to a sense of solidarity. We stand with the Zapatistas building a new society in Mexico. We support this political prisoner or that political prisoner. And then at the bottom, I think a lot of leftists wouldn't even think of it intuitively as revolutionary at all to say things like, we have to take care of each other. We have to support each other. The language associated with care work, with socially reproductive labor. Now, never mind that every single level of activist work depends on that socially reproductive labor happening. It doesn't get thought of as revolutionary, I think, because it doesn't line up with the values of toxic masculinity. So we see that within left-wing and activist subcultures, a whole lot of it comes back to gender, and a whole lot of it comes back to the degree to which men do it, and mass-coded people do it, and the degree to which communist Rambo would be seen doing it. So, moving on, what can we do about it? There are two appeals right now I'd like to make. The first one is going to be to everyone here because I think most all of us are involved in some sort of political work. I don't think we have, too many apolitical people wandering off the street into our communist education meeting. And the second is going to be specifically to those of y'all in this room who are mask-coded, who are male. So first, what can everybody do to try to change that status quo, to try to create organizational cultures and activist movements that don't assign, people work implicitly based on gender roles and that don't value certain roles and not value others based on toxic masculinity? Firstly, find out who's doing the socially reproductive labor. And when you see those people, whoever's, sweeping after the meeting or whatever, bring them into a position of leadership. Bring them into a position of power. Because I think a lot of how this functions is people who do feminized labor don't have a whole lot of power associated with that role. It's very much a disempowered thing. And I don't think the important part of the solution is just to get female and femme-coded people doing quote-unquote masculine work. It's to take this feminine-coded work and stop stigmatizing it, stop treating it as less radical and less important. And I think the other thing that everyone here in all of our organizations should do is, at a meeting, part of the work is facilitating the meeting or leading, the agenda and the discussion. Part of it is putting together signs and going out marching. Part of it is childcare. Part of it is cooking and cleaning. Part of it is talking people down when, they're upset or they're angry. And that's interfering with their ability to do the work effectively. each one of those things is equally part and equally necessary to the work that we do. And we need to make a point of consciously acknowledging that and bringing that work into the deliberate assignment of tasks that we do. So, it's common to have a treasurer who handles the money and a secretary who handles the notes, so on and so forth. I would like to see an activist culture where it is just as common to have someone who is in charge of arranging child care and elder care for the members so they can do things, or someone who is in charge of making sure that food and snacks and space setup and space cleanup are taken care of. Treat those as just as much part of activist work as the more visible stuff that might make the news. Now, secondly, I'm talking now to those of y'all who are male, who are mask-coded. There's something that I think y'all should do that I need y'all to do, and I think most of y'all's female and femme-coded comrades need. Remember what I said at the start about how literally everything that you see or interact with is, one way or other, the result of someone doing feminized, socially reproductive labor? If you don't know who did something, you don't know how it got there, you don't know how the coffee you're drinking got purchased or got brewed or whatever, you don't know who's going to sweep the floor when you're done, chances are you don't know it because it is gendered labor, because it is feminized work. So whenever that happens, you need to ask yourself, who did the work necessary to get this thing here, to make this thing happen? And if you don't know, find out and volunteer to do it. Find the feminized labor and volunteer to do it so that it doesn't stay feminized, so that it doesn't stay something that's assigned according to gender roles. Because, like I said earlier, patriarchy isn't just about incomes, it's not just about ideology, it's not just about access to power. It's about who does what work on a day-to-day basis and whether that work gets recognized and valued. So, mask and male comrades, find the feminized work and do it. Find the social reproduction and do it. And I think going along with that, this is addressed to masculine comrades in particular, but all of us really, remember that, something might intuitively sound more revolutionary if it is more confrontational and more violent. But that's not necessarily how that actually is. Recalling, looking back at the Black Panther Party, for instance, one of the factors that led to that organization's collapse was the presence of a faction led by Eldridge Cleaver that said, no, we are radical, we are revolutionary. That means that we focus on armed self-defense, on explicitly, combat type stuff. These free breakfast programs, that's not revolutionary. And then, there was the other faction associated with Huey Newton and Elaine Brown and them that was like, no, the armed stuff is part of what we do, but it's not all we do, and it's not, the basics of our approach. But the thing is, a lot of that was associated with feminized labor, and it wasn't as consistent with the values of toxic masculinity. And that ended up being one of the factors that contributed to that party's decline. And, you could name 100 other examples of that in activist movements. But remember, in the end, we're not here, to destroy the bourgeois state, to overthrow the system. We want to do those things, sure, but we don't want to do them for their own sake. We don't want to be, cool, edgy, badass radicals. What we want to do is build a world where people are equal and people are free and everyone can take care of and support each other without systems like capitalism and imperialism and patriarchy getting in the way and causing all this needless suffering. Che Guevara said, the exact quote is, "At the risk of sounding ridiculous, let me say that a true revolutionary is guided by a great feeling of love." And I think that's something that a lot of people on the left who, want to build a culture of resistance or wage people's war or whatever, kind of lose sight of. And that's because of the hegemony of the values of toxic masculinity due to the fact of patriarchy. So, to reiterate my initial thesis, we have to take conscious, deliberate steps to do better than that in our movements and our spaces. And if we don't take those steps, we'll end up in a situation like it was the women and the femmes in the kitchen while the men in the masks sat around in here and talked, Lenin or whatever.
And that was Sophia Burns of the CLP and of RATPAC speaking on the vigilance needed to guard against patriarchy taking over revolutionary political movements. The next in our series will be the question and answer session for this presentation. Thank you for joining us on our inaugural episode. If you enjoy this content, please like, comment, and subscribe to our podcast for more revolutionary presentations, commentary, and workshops.